Western academic training in the field of Islamic Scriptures and Fiqh. And at the same time, she has completed a very extensive, thorough, deep educational process in Syria in traditional settings. And when she speaks, I hope you will hear the echoes of both influences and the way she combines them in a way that I think is extraordinary. So I think I have built up the lecture well enough. And now it's Feryal's turn.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you both here and meeting with you informally after the lecture. What I've prepared today is it's on the roots of Ijtihad and how scholars have derived it from various ways of interpreting Qur'an and Hadith. And when I start with, the title of the lecture is The Role of the Qur'an, Hadith, and Ijtihad in the Basis of Difference Among Islamic Legal Scholars. And just to give you an overview so you know where we're headed, I'm going to first start with an introduction to the basis of difference among legal scholars. So I'm going to go over the Qur'an, the Hadith, the Sunnah, and Ijtihad, and how it was used during the prophetic period first. And then once we've seen how that came out of the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, we're going to look at how Ijtihad was used differently after the Prophet Muhammad's death to this day. So Islamic law, or tashri', sharia, big word used commonly today, during the prophetic period. When the Prophet Muhammad was alive, everything related to Islamic law, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, was referred back to the Prophet Muhammad as the living example. So if a problematic issue arose, they would ask the Prophet, what should we do in this particular situation? And there are various verses in the Qur'an, and this is a method used, you'll see this consistently in the way classical or traditional Islam is studied, in that anytime a scholar wants to present a point of view or to sort of prove a point, they will use verses from the Qur'an and give you hadith that back up that perspective. And then they will use other things like logical reasoning or rational reasoning. So one verse here that talks about this would be Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. So what this is saying here is, O you who have believed, obey God, obey the messenger, and those in authority above you. So this idea of obeying the prophet is Quranic. It's you can't obey God and disagree with the prophet, basically. And this is important as well because Islamic scholars categorize revelation into two forms. There's wahi matlu, which is revealed revelation, which is Muslims believe it to be the Qur'an, that it was the literally revealed word of God. And there's wahi ghair matlu, which is non-revealed revelation. And this is the idea that when the Prophet Muhammad spoke, that even when he was speaking with people in his own words, he was doing it through his divine inspiration and connection to God. And this is based on the Qur'an's words. It says, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. So nor does he speak from his own inclination. It is not but a revelation revealed. So this is referring to non-Quranic speech. And also, لَقَدْ مَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذَا بَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِنْ أَنفُسِهِمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَإِنْ كَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. Certainly did God confer a great favor upon the believers when he sent among them a messenger from among themselves, reciting to them his verses and purifying them and teaching them the book and the wisdom. The key word here is al-hikmah. Although they had been in manifest error before. And traditionally, scholars have interpreted this word hikmah as the sunnah of the Prophet. So there's the Qur'an and there's the hikmah. And there are other references as well in the Qur'an to the word hikmah. Also, Muslims saw the Prophet as an arbiter in their affairs. So, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِيمَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَجِدُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَرَجًا مِمَّا قَضَيْتَ وَيُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. So, but know by your Lord they will not truly believe until they make you, O Muhammad, a judge concerning that over which they dispute among themselves, and then find out within themselves discomfort from what you have judged, and submit in full submission. So we see this concept of the Prophet Muhammad's authority as being established within the Quran itself, and that it's an essential part of Islamic belief, is to have that element in the practice. So, and this is why Muslims perceive the Prophet as the living resource for all of their affairs. So if they had any question on what they should do, it was the Prophet Muhammad that they asked. How were the Qur'an, the Hadith, and Ijtihad used during the Prophet's lifetime? So I'm sure some of you have heard the term bid'ah. So this is a term a lot of people like to throw around. It means innovation. And some people have, it's a long topic that we can spend an hour speaking in and of itself. But basically, if you want to have evidence for any particular view, you want to show that it was actually used during the Prophet's lifetime itself. So this is why Muslims, when looking at how was Ijtihad, Qur'an, and Sunnah used when the Prophet was alive, it's important because by looking at this, then it builds that credibility that, okay, well, if it was done during the Prophet's time, it's okay for us to do this as well. If the Prophet did Ijtihad, then it's an established Sunnah that we can do later on. So this is the evidence that we have in classical sources on how the Qur'an was used, Hadith and Ijtihad. So the Qur'an was believed to have been revealed piecemeal over 23 years. So it didn't come down as one book all at once. And part of the wisdom in that is that it was an instructive model for the Muslims. So as it was being revealed, it was a dynamic book that was guiding the situation that was happening with the Muslims at the time. And so we have here, and there are other wisdoms that Muslims mention in the Quran having been revealed piecemeal. One of them was that it was a source of moral support. So over that 23 years, that by receiving the Quran throughout that period, that it was a form of encouragement and spiritual and moral support for the Muslim community. And the other wisdom here is that it enabled Muslims to memorize the Quran and learn it completely. One example of the way the Quran responded to events as they happened was the verse on tayammum. And this was, Muslims believe that this was revealed during a time, specific incident that happened. Many of you may be familiar with the Hadith al-Ifk, where the Muslims had been in a desert area with no access to water. And some of them prayed without wudu, which is ritual ablution. And at that point, the verse on tayammum was revealed, in which it's permissible in the absence of water to use soil or sand to perform ritual ablution. And the reason that's important is that it reflects the way the Quran was continuously responding to events, or it was guiding the Muslims over that period of time. Another example is the prohibition of using another person's last name. So Zayd was the adopted son of the Prophet Muhammad, and he was known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. And then the verse was revealed that do not call people except through their father's name. So Zayd then became known as Zayd, the son of Harith, rather than the son of Muhammad. So how was the Sunnah used during the lifetime of the Prophet? So according to Muslim sources, the Sunnah, or the words and actions of the Prophet, were preserved in the form of Hadith starting from the Prophet's lifetime. So we do have evidence in the classical sources that Muslims did write down Hadith, not just the Qur'an, but they also wrote down the Hadith during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime himself. And one of this is Amr ibn al-As's famous statement in which he said, I used to write down everything I heard from the Prophet, and then the Quraysh then warned me, or they criticized me, saying, do you write everything you hear when the messenger of God is a man who speaks both when angry and content? So he stopped writing for a while, and then he went back to the Prophet and he said, he told him what he was told, and he then pointed to his mouth saying, write, for by the one in whose hand is my soul, nothing comes out from it except the truth. So this is, the point of that is that we have evidence in the classical literature that Muslims did start writing Hadith down during the Prophet's lifetime. Abu Huraira is reported to have said, Bukhari's compilation, none of the companions of the Prophet transmitted more Hadith than me, with the exception of Abdullah ibn Amr. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, because he writes and I do not write. He's one of the four Abdullahs. If you hear something from one of the four Abdullahs, you take it. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As. So Ijtihad, did the Muslims use Ijtihad during the lifetime of the Prophet? And the answer is yes. The definition of Ijtihad. First, what is Ijtihad? It is to expand legal rulings on matters for which there is no clear clear scriptural reference to that, and it's derived through using analogy or rational reasoning. And you do that by looking at other rulings that might have similarities, or might be analogous, or they may have similar aims of the law, or they may have similar reasons behind the ruling for that particular rule. So many rulings after the Prophet's death have been derived through legal reasoning. Ijtihad is a legal term with a specific meaning within the context of Islamic law, so I will use the term Ijtihad a lot, rather, because there isn't quite an English equivalent to Ijtihad. So it's legal reasoning, but it's within a specific framework of Sharia, of Islamic law. Islamic scholars state that the Prophet was granted permission to use his own ijtihad, or his own best judgment, when deriving legal rulings. Also, the Prophet gave the Sahaba, the companions, permission to use their own ijtihad when they didn't have any other source to look at. And the position is derived, first again, this is a common methodology that's used in Islamic studies, where first we look at where does it appear in the Qur'an. So in the Qur'an you have the verse, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. So the key here is وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, which means it is a part of the mercy of Allah that you deal gently with them. Were you severe or harsh-hearted, they would have broken away from around you. So pass over their faults and ask for God's forgiveness for them, and consult them in affairs of the moment. So وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. So God is telling the Prophet Muhammad to consult with his companions. And from that, the scholars derive, well, obviously the companions, the Sahaba, didn't have wahy. They did not get divine revelation. The Prophet Muhammad got divine revelation, but the Sahaba did not. So the fact that the Qur'an is telling the Prophet Muhammad to consult with his companions indicates that there is an element of rational reasoning there. So he's asking his companions, what do you think? Right? He's not saying, what does God tell you I should do? He's saying, what do you think we should do in this situation, in an event where there is no clear revelation in that particular case? So this is a Qur'anic permission to use ijtihad, and it also indicates that the Prophet did do so himself in the absence of revelation. Okay, we also have events in which the Prophet made his own ijtihad on certain things, and then he was corrected by Quranic revelation, at which point he then went with the Qur'anic revelation, what he was asked to do by God in the Qur'an, according to Muslim tradition. So, for example, an example of this is during the Battle of Tabuk. This was a battle that a lot of Muslims were going to. It was hot, and during that time it was a time when Muslims were strong, so there were a lot of people known as munafiqun, people who didn't really believe in Islam, but that they were kind of covering up as Muslims. So there were many people who didn't want to participate in the Battle of Tabuk. And before he went, this is before the incident of Ka'b bin Malik, where before he went, many people came to the Prophet with excuses, I can't go because of X, Y, Z. And the Prophet is said to have excused all of those people. And Qur'an was later revealed as a response to the saying, عَفَى اللَّهُ عَنْكَ لِمَا أَذِنْتَ لَهُمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكَ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا وَتَعْلَمَ الْكَاذِبِينَ. May Allah pardon you, O Muhammad. Why did you give them permission to remain behind? You should not have, until it was evident to you who were truthful and you knew who were the liars. So this is the Qur'an critiquing an action of the Prophet. So this indicates to us what? That the Prophet in this situation did not act through revelation, but that he acted through his own ijtihad, through his own reasoning, his own rational reasoning, indicating that ijtihad was used during the Prophet's lifetime. And this is what An-Nasafi, who is a exegete, a mufassir of the Qur'an, comments on this verse, saying that it indicates the permission for prophets to use ijtihad, to use their own reasoning and deriving laws and rulings, because it's not, the Qur'an isn't criticizing the Prophet for using his own reasoning, it's criticizing the Prophet for having come up with a wrong decision, basically, in this situation. Another example of legal reasoning during the Prophet's life is found in a hadith in Sahih Bukhari, stating, a woman from the tribe of Juhayna came to the Prophet and said, my mother had vowed to perform the pilgrimage and did not perform the Hajj before she died. Can I do Hajj on her behalf? And now you see how the Prophet uses his reasoning here. He says, yes, perform the pilgrimage on her behalf. Don't you see that if your mother had a debt, you would have paid it off? Right? So he's speaking to this woman and getting her to think about this, right? So he says, don't you see if your mother had a debt, she would have been required to pay it off before receiving the inheritance? And he said, and similarly, if your mother has a debt to God, then it is permissible for you to pay off that debt before dividing the inheritance. And another example from that's both in Bukhari and Muslim, O Messenger of God, this is where the poor came to the Prophet complaining, saying that the rich have taken all the rewards because we pray as they do and we go on pilgrimage as they do, but they give charity to the poor and we don't have any money. So, they get all this reward that we don't, and it's not fair. And then the Prophet replies to this saying, upon this, he said, has God not prescribed for you a course by following which you can also give charity? So there are other ways of giving charity other than just with money. Verily, in every tasbih, which is saying Subhanallah, praising God, there is a charity. In every takbir, saying Allahu Akbar, God is great, there is a charity. In every tahmeed, Alhamdulillah, there is a charity. In every tahleel, or saying there is no God but the one God, is a charity. Enjoining good, telling people to do good things, is a charity. Forbidding evil is a charity. Having intimate relations with your spouse is a charity. And upon this, the companions were surprised, of course, and they said, O Messenger of God, is there a reward for fulfilling one's desires? And so we see that the Prophet then uses, he's getting his companions to think. He says, don't you see that if you had fulfilled your desires unlawfully, you would have been punished? Hence, when a person fulfills it lawfully, they are rewarded. So, the point is that he is using this type of logic, this legal reasoning, and that we see that it was used during the prophetic period itself. So these were clear examples of ijtihad, and scholars comment on this, saying that there may have been many other examples, but because Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad was divinely guided and that his words were wahi غير matlu, there's no way of determining was it ijtihad or was it wahi غير matlu, was it wahi that's not revealed in his decisions, because there is no clear evidence indicating it. But these hadiths that we quoted, because of either he was corrected by the Qur'an or because when in speaking with his companions he's using that logical reasoning, we know, okay, so now he's using rational reasoning. He's not saying because God told me to do this, but he's teaching his companions to think about this and using analogy here. And we also know from a hadith in the classical tradition that the Prophet granted permission for legal reasoning to his own companions. And the most famous hadith is what? Does anyone know? Mu'adh bin Jabal, right? Mu'adh bin Jabal. So Mu'adh bin Jabal was sent as an envoy, as an ambassador to Yemen. And before sending him off, the Prophet asked him, so what are you going to do? How will you act? How will you judge when you're there? So how will you act if you are asked to judge? He said, I will judge by what is in the book of God, with what's in the Qur'an. And the Prophet said, and what if it's not in the Qur'an? He said, then by the Sunnah, or the precedent of the Messenger of God. And he said, and what if it is not in the Sunnah of the Messenger of God? He said, I will use my own reasoning, ijtihad. So this is the word he used, was ijtihad, through the best of my judgment. He said, thereupon the Messenger of God struck my chest and said, thanks to the one who has granted me success, tawfiq, in making the messenger of the messenger in agreement with what pleases the Messenger of God. So this is the explicit permission for the use of ijtihad, of using your mind and legal reasoning in the case where you can't find the answer in the Qur'an or in the Sunnah. Another example is the hadith where the Prophet allowed legal reasoning, is in the following hadith. If a judge judges and uses his reasoning and is correct, fashtahad, again this is the word that's used, fashtahad, he receives 2 rewards. If a judge uses his reasoning and is wrong, then he receives only 1 reward. Okay? And this is a famous event that we should all be familiar with in studying Islamic law, because it's quoted often. Before the Battle of the Trench, the Prophet sent a group of his companions saying, do not pray the afternoon prayer until you reach Bani Qurayza. So the time of the afternoon prayer came, and they were about to miss it, and so a group of them prayed, and a group of them said, no, the Prophet said, don't pray before you reach Bani Qurayza. Well, others said, that's not what he meant. He meant get there before the afternoon prayer is over. So some of the Sahaba prayed, some of the companions prayed, and others did not. And when this was presented to the Prophet, he did not say either group was right or wrong. And this is significant because it demonstrates the ability for there to be various different legal opinions or various different ways of doing things, and there is no necessarily one right way to do it, as long as one uses his own or her own best judgment. So, what would you do if you were there? I would have been with the group who prayed, right? So, many people are very formal and literalist, right? He said, don't do it, so I'm not going to do it. But then other people's minds work differently, right? Sometimes some people are more interpretive or rational, or they're more philosophical in their way of interpreting things. And we see that Islam allows that type of a difference, right? It allows for the formalist, very literal interpretation of things, but it also allows for the more rational reasoning in things. And we see that also in the different methodologies, usul al-fiqh, that the different schools of law use. Great introduction into the reasons why scholars differ. So after the Prophet Muhammad's death, the Prophet Muhammad was no longer alive for people to ask him, what should we do in this situation? So legal scholars had to use their own reasoning to arrive at rulings. And there were various reasons, there were key reasons which scholars differ. And I've listed 8 categories here. So the first category here is in the difference in readings of the Qur'an, the qira'at of the Qur'an. And as we know, the qira'at, there's qira'at al-ashr. And the Qur'an is what the qira'at, these are the modes of reading where it may be a particular tashkil, a haraka is different, which is, we'll see an example here, or it might be one word that doesn't change the meaning, like kal-'ihn al-manfush in one reading is kasuf al-manfush, for example. And those are all parts of the 10 readings of the Qur'an. So an example here is in the verse on wudu of ritual ablution, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. So the dominant reading is that the word arjulakum, which I've put in red here, is in the accusative form. It's mansub. And that means that it goes back to washing, which is with the hands and the arms, right? And because the biru'usikum, this is jar majroor, rather than saying biru'usakum, this becomes, I have a pointer here, don't I? So this becomes, this is in the genitive, right? Rather than saying biru'usakum, this is biru'usikum. So the fact that in this reading it's arjulakum, it's mansub, means that this word here goes back to the washing. So the washing is interrupted by the wiping, and it goes back to washing the feet. But guess what? There are 3 readings in which it's read in the genitive, right? So the most common is it's read in the accusative, but there are 3 readings of Ibn Kathir, Abu Amr, and Hamza that read in arjulikum, in the genitive. So do you wash or do you wipe? This is something, and it's important for legal scholars because you want to have proper wudu. Your ritual ablutions needs to be proper in order that your prayers are accepted. It's not a light matter for Muslims. The jumhur of Sunni scholars hold and prefer the reading in the accusative. Why? Because this verse is then supplemented with scriptural evidence, and this evidence is from the Hadith. So there are, in addition to that particular verse, there are also various hadiths in which the Prophet Muhammad specifies washing of the feet rather than wiping. So one of them here is the Prophet remained behind us on the journey. He joined us while we were performing ablutions for the Asr prayer, which was overdue, and we were just passing wet cloths over our feet. So he addressed us in a loud voice, saying twice or 3 times, وَيْلٌ لِلْأَعْقَابِ مِنَ النَّارِ, save your heels from the fire, which means that they weren't washing their feet thoroughly. So this is a famous hadith. Second, the consistent practice of the Prophet to wash the feet and wipe over leather khuf. So we have, in the tradition, we have the idea of tawatur, which is something that is so widespread that it was impossible for people to have conspired together to come up with this particular hadith or this particular ruling. We have tawatur qawli in hadith. We also have tawatur fi'li, which is an action. And that the act of washing the feet was a tawatur fi'li. So the Prophet Muhammad, it was his consistent practice, which the Sahaba would practice, to wash the feet but wipe over the khuf, which is a form of leather sock that Muslims could wear when they're traveling, and that just saves the hardship of washing the feet or getting caught with your foot in the sink. Number 3, so by the verse itself, up to the ankles. And the third way that the scholars reason is that the verse in the Qur'an says up to your ankles, right? So it removes the possibility of wiping, because the limbs of the body that are wiped, like the khuf, the leather sock, or the cast, which is another time you can wipe, don't have a specification from X to X. So if you're wearing a cast, like you have a broken arm, it doesn't say you have to wipe your cast from here to here. It only specifies the place when it's talking about washing. So the fact that the verse also has those specifications indicates that it's washing rather than wiping. So then you might ask, so why are there readings that use the feet in the genitive then? Can it be used this way and still mean to wash? So what does it mean that those verses even exist? Wait, what was the question? So why are there readings that use the feet in the genitive then? Can it be used in in this way and still mean to wash? So can you use this verse in the genitive and still mean it to wash? And grammarians say yes, and they cite another verse. يُرْسَلُ عَلَيْكُمَا شُوَاظٌ مِّنَ النَّارِ وَنُحَاسٌ فَلَا تَنْتَصِرَانِ. There will be sent upon you a flame of fire and smoke, and you will not defend yourself. Now, there is another reading of this as well. Similar to the other verse, there's a reading that also reads the word nuhasun here in the genitive, which means nuhasin, right? And the meaning of the verse here is clear. Nuhasun can only be used as a subject of the sentence, and therefore it's going to be marfu' with in the nominative form. So grammatically, it can be read in the genitive, but its meaning can only be a nominative meaning. I think this might be a little bit confusing. It has to do with Arabic grammar, which is another reason why not anyone can just pick up Bukhari and do Ijtihad on their own. There's so much background and knowledge you have to have before you can do that. And what grammarians call this is khafd lil-jiwar. And what this is, it's mujawara is a term of balagha. It's a linguistic tool that is used in the field of oration that makes words sound more balanced. So if you have something that's in the genitive, the word that comes right after it, keeping it in the genitive, makes it sound more eloquent or articulate, rather than giving its technically grammatical correct usage, which would have been either nominative or accusative. But the meaning of that word does not necessarily have to mean that it's in the genitive meaning. So it's a grammatical tool. And so the Sunni scholars who interpret the verse on washing will say, when it's used in those three readings in the genitive, it's khafd lil-jiwar. It's a grammatical tool of balagha. It is not meant to be a genitive word in the meaning of it. Okay, and there's also examples of the usage of khafd lil-jiwar, this grammatical tool, in pre-Islamic poetry. And you can find that elsewhere. So, what about differences of opinion? We see that Shiite scholars and Zahiri scholars differed from the majority of Sunni scholars. Why? The Zahiris use a purely literalist approach that rejects any type of analogy or rational reasoning. And so if it's in the genitive, they will say you can do either way, even if there's all these other reasons that it doesn't really make very much sense, but they fear using any sort of rational reasoning. And nobody is really a Zahiri today. It's but it's just to show you legal methodology. The Shia do not use Hadith, and they prefer that they give preference to the genitive reading. Ta'wil is the genitive reading, and the Shia interpret this verse to mean that the feet must be wiped rather than washed, and they do not give it the meaning of khafd al-jiwar, of a grammatical tool. So you see how, do you wash? For the ruling regarding the feet, do you wash or do you wipe? So you see here how the general consensus is derived from Qur'an and Sunnah, which prefers the accusative reading, while the minor view is wiping, which is Qur'an without the Sunnah, and that is the genitive reading. Okay? So, reason number 8. How much time do we have? I'll get through this quickly. Lack of awareness of the hadith. So, this is basically that some Sahaba knew of a hadith and other Sahaba did not know that that hadith exists. And this is something that happened in the very early period by the time of the generation that followed the Sahaba and the generation after that. Hadith was recorded and it was widespread, so people were aware of hadith. An example of that is Abu Bakr did not know the ruling of whether a grandmother could inherit or not. And he brought his companions together. He asked, is there anybody who knows anything about this? And one of them said, yes, I heard the Prophet say, she gets 1/6. So Abu Bakr made his judgment based on this hadith. So this is an example of Abu Bakr not knowing a hadith that another companion had heard, and then making his ruling based on that. There's also the incident where Umar sent a group of companions to Syria. He already sent the expedition and then found out that there was a plague in Syria. So many of the people who were going were major figures within the Sahaba, of the companions. And he was on one hand concerned about just canceling that expedition, and because he started this, he didn't want to leave it in the middle. But at the same time, he was concerned of having them continue, and that once they get to Syria, that they may get sick, and he may lose some of the very important figures within the Muslim community. So after a lot of deliberation and talking, he asked the Sahaba, has anyone ever heard the Prophet say anything about this subject? So Abdul Rahman ibn Auf said, I have knowledge about this matter. I've heard the Messenger of God say, if you hear of it in a land that there's a plague, do not send forth towards it. And if it occurs in a region and you are in it, do not escape. He said, then Umar ibn Khattab, thank God I left. So that is the hadith there. Umar also didn't know the expiration time for khuf, the leather socks. So he didn't know that if you're traveling, you have 2 days. If you're a resident, you have 1 day. And then he was later told by Ali in the hadith that this is what the Prophet used to do. Okay? And again, this is something that happened during the time of the Sahaba, and by the time of the Tabi'in, the followers of the companion and their followers, hadith became widespread. The third reason that scholars differ was doubt in the reliability of a hadith. So one scholar might hold this hadith as being very reliable, another might hold it as being, somewhat reliable or questionable. Okay, so this is the idea of shufa. So the right to purchase a part of a building by its other residents or its neighbors. So this is when you have like a building and everyone owns like a room, but it's kind of a combined building. So the Prophet said in a hadith, and there's 2 clear hadiths that say if people are living in a joined area, that basically they have to consult with each other, and that if you're selling your room, other people who live in that building are the first people who have a right to purchase it before bringing in a stranger there. But does that apply to a neighbor? So there is no difference of opinion of that joint building. Does it apply to a neighbor? So Malik, Shafi'i, Al-Awza'i, and Ahmad were in agreement that this law of shufa does not apply to neighbors. And they based this relying on the hadith. If a house is divided, and it's often the case where you have words in the Qur'an and hadith that could be interpreted in a variety of ways. For example, zakat of joined livestock. Zakat is obligatory charity due on extra income, property, and livestock annually. So it's like whatever you have extra after you have spent what you need to spend on yourself. It's like if you have extra wealth, then a portion of it annually needs to be given to the poor. And that's zakat. So if a person has, say, 40 to 120 sheep, then they pay 1 sheep annually. 120 to 200, they pay 2 sheep. 201 to 300, they pay 3 sheep. And the rulings on issues related to this are derived from the hadith. So the hadith then is looked at, do not join what is separate, nor separate what is joined out of fear of paying charity. So this might be a little confusing. So let's go back here. So separating what is shared. So say you have 2 people who have 20 sheep each, and they share a farmland where the sheep eat, drink, and they have the same expenses. They have the same shepherd that takes care of those sheep. In the Shafi'i madhab, this is their understanding of what is joined. Okay, if they inhabit the same area, then they are joined. So they are required to pay 1 sheep. But if you were to separate them, no one has to pay zakat on that, right? Because each one owns 20. So what do you mean by joined? Do you mean joined as in they inhabit the same area? Or do you mean joined as in they jointly own that property? So this is again a situation where scholars differ. The Shafi'is interpret joined as those sheep inhabit the same area, right? And this is also, it shouldn't be where the zakat collector or the tax collector would either join or separate in order to get more money from the people. So an example of this could be where you have 3 partners with 40 sheep each. So if each one has 40 sheep, they each have to pay 1 sheep, right? That's 3 sheep. But if they're joined, they only have to pay 2 sheep, right? So you could have a tax collector wants to get more from them, so he'll calculate them as separate even though they're joined. Or they might be joined, and then he'll separate them. So this is the hadith, do not separate what is joined, and do not join what is separate. And again, it's a lot of mathematics, but it could be you have 2 separate individuals. One has 100 sheep, and one has 101 sheep, right? So each one has to pay 1 sheep and 1 sheep. But if you join them, now they all have to pay 3 sheep instead of 2 sheep. Now, I know none of us here are farmers, and you guys are like, well, how is this related to us? But it could be that you have 4 doctors who work in a clinic, right? And their expenses are shared, where they pay the rent for that building jointly, and they pay the electricity and the water expenses. So how do these 4 doctors pay their zakat? Right? So it doesn't have to be sheep, but it could be something that's applied to our modern day. Or it could be shop owners who own one general building that they sell their stuff in. Okay? The Hanafis interpret this differently. The Hanafis interpret joining and separation as joint ownership or separate ownership. So even if you have the shepherds who share that space, as long as they're not owned jointly, they are not to be separated. Okay. Okay. So the difference between the Shafi'i and the Hanafi school is for the Shafi'is, when the wealth exists, the zakat exists. Whereas for the Hanafis, when the mukallaf exists, or the person who is responsible for zakat exists, that's when the zakat is paid. And these are all examples of valid differences of opinion. So these are different ways that the law could be derived. So I know we're running out of time. Just mention there are multiple meanings for words, like Yom al-Adha, the day of sacrifice, right? And this is established in the Qur'an that there's 4 days. They're known as the day of sacrifice, where you sacrifice a lamb or a cow or whatever. You can eat a little bit of it, but most of it you give out to the poor in charity. So the question is, can you do it at night? Can you do it at night? Because it's Yom al-Adha, right? So can you sacrifice at night? Some say yes, some say no. Some interpret Yom as literal daylight. Some interpret Yom as 24-hour periods, right? And each one interprets their interpretation of Yom based on how it's used in the Qur'an. So you have here an example where Yom is used as a 24-hour period. And this is the opinion of the Shafi'is, Abu Hanifa, Hanbali, most of the madhahib. All right, where the Malikis and the minor opinion of the Hanbalis say, oh no, you can only do it in the daytime. Okay? فَعَقَرُوهَا فَقَالَ تَمَتَّعُوا فِي دَارِكُمْ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ. So stay in your homes for 3 days. This is an example of how it's used as a 24-hour time period. Another one is, my Lord, make for me a sign. Your sign is that you will not be able to speak to people for 3 days. So again, this is an example of Yom as day being used as a 24-hour period. But those who interpreted Yom as daylight use a different verse, saying, وَثَمَانِيَةَ أَيَّامٍ حُسُومًا, 7 nights and 8 days in succession. So this is the nights and days where the day is specifically used as daylight. And this indicates what? That there is space for a difference of opinion. Apparent contradiction of evidence. So we see that the Prophet Muhammad sometimes gave different answers to different people depending on their particular situation. Scholars then interpreted this differently. And then the 7th reason of differences of opinion is a lack of any scriptural evidence on an issue. So this is an example where scholars then use their own just logical reasoning. There's neither Qur'an or Hadith that tell you what you should do. Can a grandfather here inherit if the father is dead and the man has his siblings. Who inherits them, the siblings or the grandfather? So each of the scholars have their own unique logical ways in which they reason to say, no, the grandfather is closer to the son than his siblings, and the others say, no, the siblings are closer than the father, and they're more entitled to inheriting. So the eighth reason, and could be like a year-long course, is the difference in legal methodology. So each of the 4 schools of law have their own methodology. And this is the most complex reason, which we will not get into, but it's something to be aware of. The Shafi'i, Hanafi, Hanbali, and Maliki schools have different ways of deriving law. So they have different ways, they have different types of hadiths that are deemed reliable evidence, strong, ahad, singular, weak, etc. How do you use those? Ra'i versus hadith, rational reasoning versus a hadith, maslaha al-mursala, the common good, sad al-dara'i', preventing harm, urf, customary practice, istihsan, what is deemed good, when there are multiple possible rulings. So these are all different ways that these legal tools are used. And each madhab, each legal school gives priority, different priority to each of these. And, so why doesn't everyone just follow one madhab? Wouldn't that be a lot simpler? Right? I mean, there are people in the modern period who've advocated this, but this is a hadith in which the Prophet said, اختلاف أمتي رحمة, right? The difference of opinion among my ummah, my nation, is a mercy. And why is it a mercy? Why do you think it's a mercy? Why would you think it's a mercy? To have many different ways of doing something.
Well, you need multiple ways of doing things.
Right, so because you have then many different ways of doing one thing, and then a person could be praying this way, and that's correct, and a person is praying this way, and that's correct. A person might find this particular thing difficult for them, so they follow a legal school that allows them to do it in one way, whereas another person might be more stringent, and they might be from the people who prayed the Asr, or did not pray the Asr in Bani Qurayza, and they prefer to follow a different way, and that it's all okay, and it's all alright. And this is what allows tolerance and flexibility within the Sharia. It's when we try to say there's only one way of doing something that it takes away from the Islamic tradition, that flexibility which has traditionally been there for centuries. And what do we derive from the tradition as academics? From an academic perspective, studying the history of the Islamic intellectual tradition is a way of demonstrating to students that Muslims have always worked on making the Qur'an and Hadith relevant to their times, and in the process have come to legitimately different results, and that's okay, that there's a different way of deriving that. So as an academic, when you're looking at this, it's important to understand the Islamic tradition within the tradition and to see the intellectual tools through which they have derived that. So even if a non-Muslim is taking a course in Islamic law, I think it's incredibly informative to understand how Muslims use Islamic law. How did they derive that? Where does this difference of opinion come from? What does Sharia mean, right? The media loves to throw that around. What does it really mean? Is it really this hard, harsh, rigid thing that is out to destroy everyone's life, or is it something that is actually very flexible and fluid and allows for a variety of opinions? So that will you'll only get a profound understanding of that by studying it within the tradition. By introducing students to the logic behind positions that Muslims have taken and are taking today, students approaching Islamic studies academically is also equipped with a profound understanding of the sophistication of Islamic thought that has shaped its history and influenced its contemporary practice. So if I haven't confused you enough today with how complicated all of this is, you'll see that it's really quite sophisticated. It's not, it's more complex than it seems. So, any questions? Yes, Dr.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One methodological and one a bit theological. When you were talking about the Prophet's ijtihad, how can you reconcile ijtihad with the concept of isma of the Prophet? This is one question. The other is very simple. If you are giving a seminar on usul al-fiqh, let's say, would you still include the Shia fiqh, the Ja'fari fiqh, or you would just limit yourself to the 4 or however many Sunni madhabs you would like to cover?
Well, to address your first question, which is the isma of the Prophet, isma means infallibility, that within in Islamic theology, prophets are believed to be infallible because they're divinely guided by God. I would make a distinction between infallibility and the ability to make a mistake. When we say isma, we mean that a prophet is protected from sinning.
The isma is protection, not infallibility, I think better.
Okay, so the protection, but the protection here is protection from sinning,
Yes.
rather than the protection from having a misjudgment or making a mistake. So we do have examples in which the Prophet used his best judgment in a matter and then was corrected by the Qur'an. Like, for example, Abasa wa tawalla ja'ahu al-a'ma, right? He frowned and he turned away when the blind man came to him. And that was an example in which the Prophet did an action and then was corrected, right? Or in the Battle of Uhud, the Prophet's own judgment was that he didn't want to go to that battle, but because the companions wanted to go, he went, and that it was, even though it was against his own judgment. So these are examples of judgment rather than sin. So the Prophet is believed in Islamic theology to be protected from sinning, but that isma doesn't mean that you can't make an action that was a mistake. Because there's a difference between an honest mistake and knowingly sinning or disobeying God. And as far as your second question, I've focused here on the 4 Sunni legal schools because that's my specialty and what I know most about. I'm completely open to including Ja'fari and the Shia legal schools, which I hope to learn more about.
You mean Zaydi?
Zaydi. Yes.
I have many questions, but when we meet in the class, we'll finish the rest.
Sure.
So choose one. Now choose one.
Sure. If according to the Prophet, that differences of opinion among my community is a mercy,
Yes.
why then do certain scholars use their ijtihad, interpret a particular hadith or a verse in the Qur'an to suit a particular purpose, and then condemn another school of thought that do not agree with their own stand, to the extent that such scholars will call these other people that don't practice or agree with their own stand infidels? If differences in opinion is a mercy from God, why do we have this crisis within the scholars?
This is a very modern problem. It is a manifestation of a lot of modernist movements that have attempted to interpret the Qur'an and Hadith on their own without having been trained by teachers. The Islamic tradition, if you study the Islamic tradition within the traditional framework in which it was transmitted, preserved, and taught through a generation of scholars who taught it to a generation of scholars who taught it to a generation of scholars, this is the framework that has allowed tolerance and flexibility and allowing difference of opinion. And this is what I was saying in the end, where people say, well, this is too complicated, let's all just go back to the Qur'an and Sunnah and follow one madhab. That's what happens when you follow one particular legal school, is that you become forced to condemn people that don't follow that particular view. Whereas when you allow for differences of opinion that's derived through the intellectual tools of the Sharia itself, it allows for tolerance and differences of opinion. Yeah.
Next question. Trisha, then Dr. Michelle.
So that the framework that you just mentioned,
Yes.
which has complexity and allows us to not get into these fights, is also a framework that people can become extreme in, an extreme madhab approach.
Yes.
Let's say I
Yes.
accept all four madhabs, and now I'm very extreme against people who feel that there's perhaps a limitation or that the madhab are becoming stagnant or crystallized or something. And I'm thinking in particular about some women's issues and how some of my colleagues in chaplaincy perhaps are very into the traditional thing and kind of not willing to entertain others because they'll say, well, a feminist or a womanist or whatever angle is not a traditional tool of analysis, so we can't use it. So there's no discussion, it's just that's how do you, I mean, you would be a mentor to a lot of women in the chaplaincy program in the Islamic study program. So I guess A, do you see that too, and B, what can be done about it?
Thank you for asking that question. That's an incredibly important and insightful question. Within Islamic law, in Usul al-Fiqh, we have what is Qat' al-Thubut and Qat' al-Dalala, which is definitive in its evidence and definitive in its interpretation. And these are a few verses in the Qur'an that are clear. And clear evidence would be something that is either a mutawatir hadith or it is a verse from the Qur'an, which is then not contested. And Qat' al-Thubut, the definitive interpretation is that it can only be interpreted in one way. So, 99 means 99, it doesn't mean 101, or 100 means 100, and it doesn't mean 99 or 101. But, the vast majority of Islamic law, there's a lot of space there to move and interpret and revisit issues because, you have Qat' al-Thubut, Qat' al-Dalala, Qat' al-Thubut, Dhann al-Dalala, right? The evidence is qat'i, is definitive, but the interpretation could differ, right? And then you have where the evidence is not definitive and the interpretation is also not definitive. And then you have situations where the evidence is not definitive, but the interpretation can only mean one thing. So for women in those issues, I would first say it's important to learn the tradition for yourself. Because once you do, you'll see that there is really a lot of flexibility and room to do that from within the tradition without needing to throw it out or leave it. Many rulings are flexible, but there are different ways of interpreting that same thing. And I personally agree that following a legal school is a guideline, but it shouldn't be extreme either, that you are not willing to revisit that issue or see where did that particular perspective come from, or and that's also what we do in academic settings, whether it's at the Hartford Seminary or any other university. We don't want to have students who are subservient to a tradition that they don't understand, but rather we want people who are equipped with the tools to examine that tradition within its own framework and be willing and be capable of revisiting and re-examining these issues within their own legal frameworks.
Okay, so any other questions?
Dr. Mishu.
In addition to Dr. Mishu, anybody else keep in mind? Muhammad, Sami, anybody else? Okay, Dr. Mishu.
Good answer question.
We may not have time. I just want to see who I'm cutting off.
Thank you very much for this nice contribution. It's all very legal, jurisprudential.
Yes.
How do you reconcile it with students who would say, I see the Sharia mostly as a way of life, not as a legal system? And with the approach of Christians, who would say, I'm interested in Islam as enriching my spirituality, not as a legal system. So how would you combine those different parameters?
Traditionally, again, looking at the way Islam has been practiced over 1300 centuries, Fiqh is just the parameters of what you could do. But to use fiqh as your guidebook of what you should do is a big mistake, because we have an entire tradition of what you should do, right? So Sufism or Tasawwuf is a science within the Islamic tradition that was studied in the madrasa system along with fiqh, with theology, with all the other mainstream sciences, with hadith. And tasawwuf is, or tazkiyah, or whatever it's been called, akhlaq. I think we call it personal development today. It's a really cool term, but it's about what you should do. And if you, the beauty, in my opinion, of the Islamic tradition is that it encompasses both. It has that outward practice, but it also has the science of spirituality. And when they're combined, that's when you have a more balanced perspective. So a person who is looking for spirituality in Islam can find that spirituality through looking at the Sharia, but not seeing the Sharia as a ghaya or a means in and of itself, but that this is as an end in and of itself, but that the Sharia or the laws are there for the end of becoming ultimately close to God, and that Islamic ethics will be derived from the science of tasawwuf or Sufism rather than books of fiqh.
Now that I know who the other people were who are going to ask questions, I apologize. We're out of time. I have to cut you off. Thank you so much.